All right, what is up, Internet? So we're gonna start here from the Hanging Gardens of Babylon again. After all, this series is called Grinding. Speaking of, we have a new theme song that I will be implementing on these videos here soon. And but I'm very excited about this episode. This episode is called it's number 4. This episode's called "The Right of Self-Defense," and Dylan McCormick joins Nate Cap in this episode. Is a very important episode, as all of these episodes are. But this particular one is one of my favorites. It's just so good. So, shoot, yeah. I guess we're just gonna get into it. Let's go.
And that's one of the things about religion that we have to remember when we're talking about that makes it such a hot topic issue is because we're talking about law. Who gets to be God? Who gets to be God's deputies? Who is the Most High? Who is the divine authority? It's all about the claim to the Most High. The only way that somebody can be higher than us is if we give away our power. Because there's nobody, we're all equal. But we're not equal in our knowledge, so ultimately I think it does have to be a hierarchy, but it has to be a cooperative hierarchy like a bee colony. It's about what our value system is, what we care about.
Hello, Hive Mind. Today is May 19th, 2020. I am your host, Nate Cap. Welcome to the 4th CubbyWhole podcast, where important topics are unveiled, discussed, and tested. Our website is CubbyWhole.com. That's CubbyWhole.com. Today, we are going to switch it up a bit. I have a really special guest and close friend, Dylan McCormick. He is an occult researcher, studies and teaches natural law, has thoroughly studied the Constitution. He has a passion in video game designing, and he has built a really strong marriage with his awesome wife in Idaho. He was going to come to the Seed 4 growth event in May, which was postponed, but we're going to get into some of what he is going to present here today, including exploring mainly the principle of self-defense and the Second Amendment. Thanks for being on, man.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be on.
Awesome. So, one of the first questions I have for you is, what is the right of self-defense, and why was it written into the Second Amendment?
So I think to answer that question, you first have to ask yourself, what is a natural right even? And the quickest way that I can define that is a natural right is something that you can universally will, that all entities are capable of doing, and in doing this action, it does not prevent any other entity from practicing the same thing. And so self-defense it fits that bill. It is something that I can universally will, all other agents are capable of, because it is not aggressive action. It is defensive by its very nature. It was written into the Second Amendment because the Constitution is ultimately a body of government trying their best to recognize natural rights in themselves. And so the Second Amendment is derivative of the natural right of self-defense.
And is there anything other than man's law that is limiting our right to self-defense?
One of the largest problems currently, I would say, is culture. So it's man's law and man's perception of how society ought to operate. It has a very chilling effect if all of my neighbors really look down on a certain behavior or ownership of a certain thing. And that might be a lot more deleterious to my ability to own something or act in a certain way than a law. It might be within any person's nature to disregard a law because they don't fear being caught by law enforcers. Social shame is a really powerful mechanism in preventing someone from doing something. And there is a lot of shame directed towards the ownership of weapons, or maybe I should say, attempt to shame people for owning weapons. Not only this, you also have the polarization or perception that is coupled with owning a weapon, that you are either crazed in some way or that you desire to use it. You want to be John Wick. You want to be some kind of mass shooter if you own this thing.
Why do you think that is?
Well, one, I think in general that people have a fear about weapons in general, firearms specifically, and the fear stems from, one, it is a killing tool. The very nature of this object is that it is meant to take a life. That is scary, objectively, in a lot of ways. So if you have this thing that is scary because it provides this function of dealing death, it means that you have to be responsible around it. So that's a great obligation, and obligation is scary as well. So I'm scared because if I have this thing, now I have to live up to the task of bearing this burden. And I think that a lot of people are also scared that others may use this thing against them. And so if you have the fear of having to be responsible for yourself in the possession of a weapon, and then you're also scared that someone else in possessing this weapon, they might use it against you, it creates this this compounding effect where not only are you unwilling to own one to defend yourself, but I can't even allow you to own one because you might use it against me.
Right. Another question I have is, what is the state doing right now that is creating a major threat to our rights to bear arms?
So this is I really like this question because it changes basically once a week. It's in constant flux. This was a thing that I considered talking very heavily about at Seed, and at the time when I was writing my presentation, the TAPS Act and red flag laws were the current topic. That was the current thing that was a very clear sign of greater infringement. Right now, today, in the midst of all of this pandemic response, the coronavirus fear, you can look at all of the municipalities, the localities. It's happening at state level in some states. You have different government agents who are attempting to ban the sale of firearms, in quotes, temporarily, because either it's not safe to go outside, you might get sick, and so you have to go outside to go to the gun store. I would say that it's part of it is a response in seeing all of these people suddenly become interested in buying guns. If I were in the government and I saw a bunch of people who consistently vote for gun control suddenly buying guns, that presents turbulence for me, a member of the government. I'm a little scared that all of a sudden these people who have been trying to disarm now don't care about this belief that they once had. They want to get armed.
So the Constitution really doesn't protect us then, if they're going to. So what would you say to the people of, like, what can you do then if the Constitution's not going to protect you, and, like, if you have a firearm, what can you do?
So this should not be perceived as a direct call to action or encouragement of breaking the law, but most people have recognition that a man-made law can be invalid. The consistent thing that I like to explain to people who maybe this idea makes them uncomfortable is we have a modern understanding in the United States that slavery was wrong. Well, slavery was the law. It was man-made law, and it was illegal to free a slave. It was illegal to aid in the freeing of a slave. So that means we know for certain, even in the US, we're capable of having laws that are counter morality. So should we have punished someone who was caught for aiding a slave? Of course not. And we should be glad that those people did do that. We should be glad that people fight against laws that are unjust. Well, how do you circumvent a law like gun control? Well, it's really easy. Illegally obtain firearms. The reality is that in most states, you are still capable of obtaining a weapon let's say you live in a place like California or New York, that weapon might be neutered in a lot of ways. It might lack a lot of functions that make it eminently more usable, but you can legally obtain firearms, and you should be doing that. You ought to be doing that. If it's a thing that you have any vague interest in, just go for it. Do some research, buy a gun. Go out and buy a gun. If you are not able to own a gun for some reason, maybe consider circumventing the law.
Where would you recommend people go to, further understand firearms? Like what books or what researcher or someone who talks about firearms, where would you send someone to help them understand firearms better?
Well, I suppose that it depends on what kind of information specifically they're looking for. If it's a person saying like, all right, I want to buy a gun, but I don't know anything about guns, where should I go to learn about guns? I would probably just tell them to go on YouTube. And I know it's such a vague, like not really helpful answer, but one of the benefits of the internet and the way social media and YouTube specifically have functioned is that it really has fostered a lot of content creators that talk about modern firearms. There are people who talk about the history of firearms. I do enjoy the content of a channel on YouTube called Forgotten Weapons, where it's someone who is basically just talking about weapons in history, and he does field strips and detail strips of weapons and kind of just talks about their development. I think a lot of people probably, in order to own a weapon and be interested in defending yourself, you don't have to have any interest in the history of firearms or really like the underlying knowledge of that thing. Most things that people interface with, they don't have an actual understanding of how it functions or how it goes together. Pretty much everyone uses a phone. Do you know how a phone actually works at every level? Of course not. It's incumbent to have an understanding of how a gun works to the extent that you can operate it correctly, but you don't need to know absolutely everything about firearms in order to own one and use one effectively.
Something I've been seeing in the news that I've heard you speak on is these people, they're called tracers, that are going around door to door looking for people with disease that's currently taking place right now. Who are they, and why are they so dangerous when it comes to owning a firearm?
So, right now, to my knowledge, there are 2 states. One of them I can't remember. The other is Nevada. And at the state level, they are right now authorizing these contact tracing groups. If people want an idea of what type of response this is, they should look at the construction and founding of the Department of Homeland Security directly after 9/11. You used this event as a pretense to construct a new layer of law enforcement. And this is a really abstract and strange form of law enforcement because it's enforcement of laws around you being sick or potentially having associated with someone who is sick. So these contact tracers will be authorized to canvass. This is a word that I see used very frequently, is canvass. It is something of a buzzword. They're going to canvass. They're going to go out and kind of have an understanding at this local level of who has been sick and who have you been around. And what it does is actually quite similar to the TAPS Act, where the TAPS Act, I cannot recall off the top of my head what TAPS stands for. The way the TAPS Act functions is basically that it allows police departments to conduct individual threat assessments of people in households. You can look at the way law enforcement in some states, they will color code a household depending on who is there. you get a red color coding if you might be someone who is a threat. Well, these contact tracers provide a new avenue to allow for the individual assessment of certain people. I don't want to interact with you. You don't want to interact with this contact tracer. And what that means is you may be somewhat standoffish. Well, these people are authorized by the state to be able to investigate you to some extent, to come into your home, to make sure that you haven't associated with certain sick people, to know where you've been. And to the extent that you are going to resist interaction with these people, they will be authorized to have police or other law enforcers aid them in basically coercing you. It is a way of almost guaranteeing conflict between people who aren't willing to play this game, to kowtow to this type of behavior.
That's crazy. What is it? What is, I feel like that leads to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is what the boogaloo means and why that's a very dangerous thing.
So, the boogaloo is basically this term that developed mimetically, where it was a non-serious, it was a playful way to refer to the notion of a second civil war in the United States. The peak of its popularity resulted in I believe it was the ADL recognizing it as, this was their words, a right-wing hate term, I believe. And the boogaloo really evolved out of this culture of, this modern culture of people being tired of infringement upon their rights. And you have this happening at multiple levels. I think you have a lot of people who would probably be defined as like somewhat mainstream conservatives in the United States who are tired of the slighting of specifically the ability to own firearms. And I think that you also have, people who are small aisle or statist libertarians who are involved in this. You have people who are anarchists who are involved in this. The central issue does generally seem to me that this boogaloo culture evolved out of people seeing all of this effort being put into depriving people of the ability to own firearms, to own weapons. It's dangerous for a couple of reasons, I would say. It's dangerous, one, because while I think it was funny, there have been funny things that have come out of it, I would also say it's a little bit cringy. It's dangerous that you are making light of this thing, and we should approach the idea of a civil war, any form of killing, should be really broached very seriously. I'm all for gallows humor, but one, self-defense is a serious topic. The boogaloo, or the idea of this second civil war, is being evolved out of a very serious issue, which is you feel your rights are being taken from you. It's also a little cavalier to just say, well, we're just going to have a second civil war. Are you? Do you really understand the implications, the way that societal collapse occurs if this happens? I think that people, if you right now are listening to this and you are a person who's like, I just want to do a second civil war. I just want to go out and kill people. That's what I think the solution is. How much energy have you put into changing people's minds through speech? How much energy have you put into peaceful reconciliation with people? People are open to having their minds changed, whether they understand that or not. And it's about finding ways to communicate with people. And often the ways that we use to communicate with people are social media. And I will say that I don't think that that is an effective way of doing this. You should do this with people in your personal life. If you know someone who is a person who you think you would come into conflict with in a second civil war. Try to change their mind peacefully. Approach them as if believe that they have good intent, and speak to them as if they're your peer. You will make ground with that person, most likely. And that has been my experience in my personal life.
Yeah, and so I would say that's exactly what the militia is all about. So if you want to go ahead and tell us about the militia and how that's defined in the Constitution, I think we can definitely better understand what it means to spread this information, help people understand that we are the militia, and it's about educating each other and caring enough to educate each other rather than act out of emotion and not really knowing what your rights are and how to handle hard situations like we could be in.
So the militia is, first I want to say what the militia is not. The militia is not the military. In the Second Amendment, the term militia, the word militia, I believe, is actually capitalized, and it is used very specifically because a militia is comprised of a body of civilians. You are not a professional soldier if you're a militia. You are a person who is capable of mustering. You're capable of joining up with other people and using force, but that is not your job. That is not your profession. So I have a few instances of the Federalist Papers mentioning the militia. And let me be very clear. I am anti-federalist in nature. But it is useful to look at this document that was used to sell federalism, that was used to advocate for it, because even in this document, John Jay and Alexander Hamilton are saying very clearly what the militia is and how it's going to function and how it's going to keep the federal government in check and the importance of it. So in Federalist Paper number 4, John Jay specifically mentions the militia must be consolidated into a single corps, C-O-R-P-S, for people who aren't familiar with that, basically meaning a military structure, that it must be consolidated into a single corps in a time of mustering when dealing with foreign threats. So what does this imply? It implies that typically the militia is operating autonomously from one another. The militia are state entities. They're not a nationwide entity. One of the arguments that you very consistently see is, oh, well, the militia is the military. No, they're not. The military is the military. And the militia is not the National Guard either. The National Guard is, 1, national in how it is organized, and 2, it's a branch of the standing military. In Federalist Paper number 24, Hamilton states that a small standing military it may have to exist. In fact, it's going to have to exist, no matter how distasteful it is. And the utility of this small standing military is that they're going to occupy garrisons, and it's because they're concerned about dealing with American Indians. They're concerned about Britain and Spain. And they're worried that if they have to occupy these garrisons with militia members, that the militia members are basically going to burn out. They're going to be separated from their families, and it's going to basically discourage them from even being in the militia. So what that means is that in Federalist Paper number 24, Hamilton is recognizing a standing military is not the militia. We're going to have this thing, and it's going to be small, but we're going to have it, and it's going to be distinctly different from the militia. And the last example from the Federalist Paper I'll bring up is Federalist Paper number 29. It states that the militia are meant to be regulated. This is also wording that is used in the Second Amendment itself. It's an anachronistic term. To be well regulated means to be organized or in uniformity. And that they are going to have to be able to be organized into a uniformity by a federal body potentially, but also at the state level. So a militia is going to have to be able to be organized in such a way that all of the members of that militia are versed in the same tactics. They have similar weapons that they can exchange with one another. There is compatibility in their weapons and their equipment. They will generally operate as state entities, but also the Federalist Paper number 29 recognizes that the Union, the federal government, is supposed to have a duty to arm and discipline them, and that also is going to exist at the state level as well. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad that you got those documents. It's interesting whenever I talk to people about the forefathers. They're so quick to say that the forefathers were all of them were slave owners, and therefore I'm throwing out everything of the Constitution and what it means. What is your take on the forefathers, and were they all slave owners?
So, one, just a few minutes of research will yield the information to anyone that no, they were not all slave owners. Something that I think is really important for people to understand is that history is about, and in fact, one of the founders actually used a quote that was similar to this. It's about standing on the shoulders of giants. You are working in modernity to create a better future using the tools that were left to you from the past. And it's also a mistake to consider the founders as a monolith. There was great disagreement among nearly every person. And if you want this to be illustrated for you, look no further than the relationship between someone like Samuel Adams and Alexander Hamilton, or Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was a vehement anti-federalist, still in this same body of people. So I want to go back to this idea that you are working with tools from the past. One of the things that did get me into natural law was basically Western philosophy, and I became, over time, I actually resisted it quite a bit at first because I used to be a moral relativist. I became really fascinated by Descartes and Immanuel Kant. And really, we don't get Immanuel Kant unless we have Descartes. And maybe we don't get either of these people if we don't have Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. So we also, in that same way, we don't get the Constitution without the Magna Carta. I look at the Magna Carta and I go, that's weak. That's nothing. The Constitution, no, there's more there. And so I can look at someone who I don't agree with everything that they've done, but I can recognize the good that they have done, and I can say, all right, I'm going to take the constructive things that they've done and I'm going to build them even stronger. And this notion that someone has to have done absolutely everything correctly for me to be able to recognize any amount of good they've done is absurd. And it's especially absurd when you consider the amount of people who might say something like, oh, well, the founders were all slave owners, and so nothing that they did was positive. We have to throw it all out. There's a decent chance that this very same person will defend the actions of some other tyrant in history saying, well, you know, it was positive because it's fine that Stalin did the Great Purge because he industrialized Russia and the effects of that were so good. There, unfortunately in history, and I'm not justifying this, it is simply the state of things, most things that are positive have been coupled with absolute horrible ramifications. And what we should do is work to take the positive and excise the negative things from it, to strive towards perfection, to strive towards perfecting the things that we have left to us by past generations, while getting rid of the errors that they made.
Right. So that brings me to my next question, which is, I hear this so much where people say high-powered guns of today weren't accounted for when the Constitution was written. So, in your understanding, what difference does it make whether a firearm can shoot multiple rounds or just a few, like a musket, as everyone refers to when making this argument?
It doesn't make a difference. The Second Amendment is outlining principle, which is that the citizens of a nation ruled by government, in order to maintain freedom, they are going to have to be as well armed as whatever standing military exists, and that they're going to have projective force that keeps the government in check. Recall that the founders are a group of people who were terrorists that overthrew an empire. They recognized very intimately that force was a valid way of either eliminating tyranny or keeping it in check. They knew that there was the potentiality that the government they were constructing could become tyrannical, and that people were going to have to stop that.
All right. All right, it's a good spot to wrap it up. We're going to take a little break. We'll be right back.